Welcome to The Logic of Generosity, the podcast for bold nonprofit leaders who refuse to settle for ordinary. Here, we cut through the noise with unfiltered insights from fundraising experts designed to spark bigger gifts, deeper donor connections, and a brighter future for your mission. Let's dive in.
Well, this episode is brought to you by Pleiades Nonprofit Advisors, and we now offer database services from a certified Blackbaud Razor's Edge, NXT, and Network Plus database administrator. Less friction means more mission. When your data's a mess, your message misses. When it flows clearly, your mission gains momentum. At Pleiades, we design clarity. We bring order to chaos so that your team can focus on what matters. Identifying interested donors, building meaningful donor relationships, and moving faster with confidence. Relevance begins with clean data, the right message, right person, right time, but that only happens when your data is accurate, useful, and accessible. Our three essentials are data cleanup, clear vision, that's going to be the result. No more duplicates, no more undeliverables, no more wasted time. We'll standardize names, emails, and addresses so that your outreach works the first time, every time. We also offer CRM migration and setup, which allows for a smooth, thoughtful transition. Switching systems should not feel like skydiving without a parachute. We precisely carry your donor history, we validate every field, and we're going to map everything carefully so nothing is lost and nothing breaks along the way. The third thing we offer is staff training, empowered people, smarter decisions. It's not enough to have a better tool. Your people need to know how to use it. We train your team, we customize your protocols, and we build their confidence to own the system from day one. We also offer other items like custom reporting, ongoing CRM support, and workflow design. But finally, you've got a system that works. No more chasing reports, no more apologies for messy data, just a clean, functional, mission-aligned CRM environment designed to help your people do their best work. Because when data works, your mission moves. So Brian Nielson, I'm so glad to have you on the show. And one of the things that we were just chatting about just before we started recording is fantasy football. And I want to hear some things about it. I just want to do once or say one thing getting into this is I've never gotten into fantasy football. I mean, I understand the social thing. Even as I was trying to have a conversation with my nephew just yesterday, who gets into fantasy football, and he goes, "Why are you even bothering? Don't do it." And I go, "Well, I mean, have you been doing it for a while?" And he goes, "Yeah, a long time. It's really just about the banter." Um, and Sherry, how your team is going to just destroy the other team in this fantasy league. But you got into it.
Yeah.
And what did you discover about it?
So I got into it purely for the social, and I'm not a sports guy. I don't tend to go to games. I don't track. I have teams that I have slight awareness of, but in many cases that awareness is extremely dated and or as in my professional fundraising career, people would ask who I was a fan of or who'd I root for, and it was always the team that was affiliated with my paycheck, right? I was happy to root for those teams and learned as much as I needed to know at that time and moved on. And there's some great, slightly embarrassing stories. In fact, I'll share one and then transition into fantasy football. For fans of basketball, I worked at the University of Cincinnati and had to ask the question, who's Oscar Robertson? And now that I know who Oscar Robertson is and the impact that he's had on the game and his legacy, it felt like an embarrassing question, right? But knowing now, but here's this groundbreaking athlete and just not even anywhere on my radar until it had to be. And then, of course, I dive deep and learn a lot. So that's my level of kind of sports ambivalence is probably the best term. However, a couple decades ago, I got into fantasy football. A friend was doing it. He's like, "Hey, you're new to the area. We'd recently moved. It's a great way to meet some guys." And so first year, just absolutely destroyed, just learning what it is, how it works, what matters to what, people are buying. This is back in the magazine days and pulling whatever they can. I have a cousin who is huge football fan, watches all the games, multiple TVs, multiple screens, other feeds go, and it's a full immersive experience for him.
That's called a sports
And he
book,
starts
by
a
the way.
family league. His sports nut, maybe he's a little he's heavy into it. So he starts a fantasy football league for the family. I'd started playing with friends, do it with family. And I discovered, and this is where I got excited about it. I discovered two guys, and this, by the way, just a little spoiler. This group, they don't do this anymore. So they did this for a long time. It's gone away. I don't know. It went away after I was not paying attention, so I don't know where it went. But at the time, it was called the Football Docs. Two PhDs in mathematics, huge fans of football, and they start developing an algorithm looking at all kinds of indicators and building these data profiles around what matters. So when it comes to the draft, for example, they would analyze and indicate, hey, here's players who are difference makers in a particular category. Here's where it matters, where the quarterbacks really are distinguishing and unique versus a group of quarterbacks who are somewhat interchangeable when it comes to the points, right? Um, and they would let you, and if you haven't done a lot of fantasy football, every league gets to set its own rules. How much different things matter? What's the weighting of a touchdown versus yards gained, and yards that are rushing versus yards that are passing? Right? They get to set all of those. The commissioner kind of decides all that stuff. Their algorithm will let you punch in all of your statistics and then spit out draft sheets based on your league and its rules of which players were likely to have an impact. And they had all kinds of little data points, like wide receivers in their third year tended to kind of pop and have a breakout year, and different. The whys don't even matter. They just have this algorithm, and then throughout the season, they would update as players got injured, as trades were made, as other things happened. They would kind of drive and have that. So I subscribed, $20 a year maybe for their service. Used it for all my leagues. And the first year I subscribed, I won my family league. The next year, I won the family league. My cousin is apoplectic. He just totally flabbergasted. We were together for a family thing. He's like, "So what's your strategy? When are you?" He's like, "I'm watching those games. I'm changing my draft last minute based on what I think the coach had, or I saw the coach talking to a player. So maybe is he going to get a little bit more time on the field?" I'm like, "I don't even watch the games. I check in Monday morning, see how things went, set my schedule by the deadline, check in on Monday. There you go." Um, what made it even more fun is life was busy, young kids, lots of things going on. I took a year off. Said, "Guys, I need to take a break. I can't be in the league this year. Sorry about that." So they found somebody else played. And then the following year, I had missed it. I'm like, "Okay, I'm back. I'll come back in." Won again. So 2 years, I won in a row, took a year off, came back, won the third year, and all from the data, right? It was not about, and it's almost sad because I don't have any passion for football, but I had total passion for the data and
Right.
what these guys had created that I could then leverage, and it worked for me, worked very, very well for me. It was a good time. So
That is hilarious. And
yeah.
I remember even seeing you present on data, and I can imagine that it just translated into the fun part, of
Yeah.
are you still doing many
No,
presentations on data stuff with regards to fundraising? Are you kind of in that game at all right now?
not a lot at the moment. So I've when I transitioned from working for charities full time to now working independently. I consult for the charities. I'm in the data space in the consulting work we do and helping them think about what data is relevant and where they are. So I'm a huge believer in data for understanding and for storytelling. But as I'm also building an estate planning practice and kind of back on the direct client side. I get a little bit more time and energy there. And the messaging or the story that needs to be told, data still is a story and people need to understand it. And we'll probably get into some more of that later today. But I think the storytelling needs to be a little bit more of a focused and understanding the individual. And so when I'm presenting, I tend to be talking more about that and context and understanding, and less about how to think about how to use the data, just where the conversations are right now.
Right on, right on. I want to talk more about that. So we'll circle back and we'll touch on that.
Sure.
in a greater level a little bit in a bit. Um, it's funny that you just mentioned, not really being super interested in the actual sport of football, but far more just the data, and especially
Yeah.
using that data to pretty much just, overwhelm the other people that you were competing against in the fantasy football league. So my son, when he was doing his undergraduate at U of A, and I'm a Sun Devil background, and so I was trying to stir up something. I was saying, Michael, let's go to a football game, or let's go to, a basketball game. And he just looks at me and says, Dad, you actually have to care about that sort of stuff. And I go, yeah, you're right. You do.
Yeah.
I thought it would be something fun to do. And so he last year, so he's actually a mathematics he's in quantum mathematics at Berkeley. He just completed
Okay.
his PhD, and he's now actually doing research at Berkeley in his postdoc. So we go over to Berkeley and watch a cow game. And I could just tell I was trying to be a lot more engaged with the game than he was, and he's thinking, "Can we go shoot pool?" Or he goes, "Can we play ultimate frisbee?" Or do frisbee golf or something like that. And they're like, okay,
Yeah.
um,
He wants to be hands-on, less of a spectator, more of a participant.
definitely, definitely more of his generation, unless maybe you grew up playing team sports and really engaging in that, but that wasn't necessarily his thing. His was
Yeah.
very much more of the, like you say, the hands-on sort of thing. So a little bit of background. I mean, now that you are working your own practice, and I want to get to that in just a second. I think it would just be good for folks to know a little bit about your background. You are an attorney by training, and now getting back into the work of an attorney and doing some really good things, I believe, on the business planning side, on the estate planning side, on the I mean, you sound like you have a number of different things that you're focusing on, and I want to talk about that as well. But give us a little bit of background. When you were doing training as an attorney and going to law school, was fundraising on your mind, or what was on your mind, and what were you originally headed towards? Because sometimes it's like, I just kind of fell into this and here we are. I don't know what your
Yeah.
story is, though.
I fell into the fundraising, right? There's the TLDR on this. It wasn't a direct path to the fundraising, but I've always had a commitment to service, and in being involved with charitable organizations. So even before I was a professional fundraiser, I was sitting on boards. I was working in fundraising campaigns. I've always been active in church service as well as other community service organizations, and I like that engagement. I'm also I love stories. As a kid, I was given a book, and I used to listen on the radio. So I'm dating myself on books and radio, right? We're in a whole different generation. But there's a brilliant radio guy, Paul Harvey, and he used to do
Yeah,
a thing called the rest of the
rest of the
story.
story.
Uh, and so I had those printed. Oftentimes, my dad and I in the evenings, a couple times a month, we'd have some errands that we'd have to run together, and it was the right timing that show was broadcasting. And inevitably, we'd get to our destination, but we didn't get out of the car until we got the last little bit of the rest of the story. And so I've always been um, intrigued with and have this awareness that there's more to it, right? There's what we see on the face, and then there's stuff behind that, and that's always been interesting to me, and that's relevant here as my career kind of progressed. I started out of law school, decided to do estate planning, was with a firm, and then had my own practice, and really was focusing on high net worth planning and sophisticated tax planning, which at that time was a whole different stratosphere. We were talking about we were dealing with law changes and thresholds where for decades we'd planned around a 650,000 approximately, right? It was a very number, but roughly 650,000 meant you could have a taxable estate, and a
Right.
couple could use trusts to accomplish a doubling of that and have a 1.2, 1.3. And so there's a much wider audience for tax focused or estate tax focused planning,
Right. Right.
and that all started to change. When you talk about history of presentations, I've given hundreds of presentations where I would walk through all of the timeline from 2000 to 2010 because we have this set of laws that were in place where these numbers were going to continue to increase and then disappear and then fall back. And right, we kind of dealt with that. And during that time, during all of that stuff happening, I was like say focused on high net worth or some of that tax strategy planning, um, and learned the importance of collaborative planning and learned to you can't be an expert in any one aspect. You need to work with others. You need to be um, contemplating the plan from multiple angles. And I got involved with an organization that was teaching multidisciplinary practice and collaboration and working with other advisors. And through that, I was essentially recruited to close down my practice and join a now good friend at the University of Cincinnati, at the University of Cincinnati Foundation, I should say. So he had had a long and successful estate planning practice, had decided to focus on charitable giving, and was working as director of estate and gift planning, or um, I think we're gift planning. I always chuckle that every time I've changed jobs, the field of plan giving, gift planning, estate and gift planning, right, it continues to evolve.
Yeah.
I love that Dr. James has research on which of those we should use, and the reality is donors don't understand any of them, but that's how that is. So I shut down my practice as well. I was in Colorado at the time, moved to Cincinnati with my family, worked for the University of Cincinnati Foundation, and then was there for a good season. Moved from Cincinnati to the College of Worcester,
Oh
spelled like
yeah.
it
Yeah.
sounds, Wooster. So not in Massachusetts, but Northern Ohio.
Right.
Small liberal arts, amazing school with some great legacy and history. Learned a lot, did a lot, and then had an opportunity to come to Arizona and work at in support of ASU at the ASU Foundation and later ASU Enterprise Partners. And in that process, it's an interesting evolution. Personally, I had shifted from I'm an attorney who helps do estate planning or helps with charitable giving to I'm a fundraiser and in the fundraising mindset, and then ended up shifting back into I'm an attorney for charities and now attorney individually and consultant for charities. So this my own story
It's
kind of
quite a
takes these
circle.
pivots and turns along that process. Yeah.
When
And,
you went,
and
I'm curious really quickly, when you went from an attorney or an estate planning attorney and into the philanthropic world, how was that shift? I mean, because in many cases, attorneys don't necessarily go into philanthropy very often. So it's a bit of a mindset shift, I would imagine, especially as a practicing attorney going into philanthropy. Can you share a little bit about what you said you had a friend at University of Cincinnati, and so I'm just kind of wondering maybe if he just kind of introduced the world to you, or how did that work?
Yeah, so he had made that shift already. He having had an estate planning practice and then moved into the plan giving space. And so he was there to he could both recognize what I knew, and that was something that he felt like was needed. So some technical awareness and expertise, which I don't want to overemphasize that, but that was what there was a need at that time. And so he brought me in for that, and then I had to learn the fundraising side, the fundraising mindset, and learn operations for charities and thought processes. And so it was real. What I point to as kind of a marker of that was I noticed when I shifted from two things. I would say I'm an attorney who does fundraising to I'm a fundraiser. That was a mental shift that occurred for me. And it took me probably a year and a half to go from referring to the people I worked with the most as clients to being donors. And then now keeping track of when am I working with a donor versus a client. And so that's just kind of my little, I can tell for myself where my head is if I'm defaulting to client or donor as my reference to the people that do the work and interact with.
You had mentioned that the estate tax was far, far, far lower than
Yeah.
anything that we know today. Of course, gosh, from 2018 onward now to permanent law. And going back to, the earlier, the mid 2000s, and I'm guessing that's kind of the time when you were at University of Cincinnati. And I would imagine that with such a low threshold for state taxes to be, employed, were they always 40%? Was that always kind of the gist, or?
No, it's fluctuated. It was lower in some years and much higher in other years, and so that was one of the moving targets. The threshold would move, and then the percentage was also adjusting. I
Okay.
couldn't give the exact breakdowns, but it has changed. It's been much higher in the early '80s even, and lower at certain moments in that
Okay.
whole process. And I'm going to make a note because used, and I chuckle every time it's used. We need to acknowledge that permanent means something different in the world of Congress versus the way you would read it in the dictionary.
Yeah.
And the
Okay.
evidence of that is the estate tax has been permanently repealed at least 6 times.
Okay. I
So
can see
after
why
the
that
first
might be
one, we need to
confusing.
acknowledge that permanent doesn't mean what we think it means. And so in a congressional or in a context, what we really mean by that, and this is just a fascinating wordplay, what we mean is it's not set to automatically expire. So permanent doesn't mean never changing. It just means we don't have an expiration date built in. So as we talk about even the recent changes, some of the provisions that were introduced on thresholds in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 were set to go away in 2026. And now we have there's some debate on how we should reference it, but the however many B's you want to stick in there, a act, right? This is out there. It made it permanent, but what it really just said is we're taking away the automatic expiration.
Okay.
So change of change of political leadership, change of
Yes.
parties in control, change of lots of things could bring that back. So careful on how we say permanent, and we'll talk about what that means a little bit. Right, those changes are having some ripple effects in the estate planning community relative to what was common when the taxes were so much more common, when the
Yeah,
tax thresholds were lower and were affecting more people.
for sure. I guess maybe one of the questions that I have is dating back to when you were working with far lower thresholds. Did you find yourself engaging in charitable solutions at a far greater level, whether it be lead trust or charitable remainder trusts, or to really combat that estate tax issue? And do you find yourself doing less of that, or are you just working with maybe higher net worth donors who are still above that threshold of a much higher level?
Yeah, there's two parts to that answer. So one part is as we learned and studied and we talk about strategies for mitigating estate tax, it always felt like, hey, we're going to do lots of strategies and there's lots of things that can be done without involving charity. And then our little capper, our little wrap up at the end would be we're going to stick a testamentary plat in there to kind of mop up any leftover estate taxes, convert it to have some charitable benefit with the goal of, hey, there's something come out for the heirs. So that was often in there. At that time, the other number to be mindful of is the applicable federal rate for discounting and for charitable gifts was much higher. And
Hmm.
so we have this inflection point that happens 2009, 2010, somewhere around there. I used to keep a chart and I'd have to go back and look that when the AFR is above 5%, the advantages or the motivations, the thresholds to make some of the charitable gifts work is different, especially for lead trusts.
Hmm.
Remainder trusts still can work, but become um, remainder trusts are more attractive when we have a higher AFR and that kind of inverses.
Hmm.
But the tax benefits of lead trusts are relevant to such a small number of people, even smaller now that we just don't see them or use them as often.
Yeah, they
But
tend to
so
be looked like
that's kind of
unicorns. Yes. Oh,
yeah.
you know.
What's happening though, even as we're talking, is um, it's fun to explore kind of these details, right? And think about the math and apply the problems. And it's happening. I see tons of posts and lots of people commenting on here's the implications of OBA and the changes in deductions and thresholds. The reality is most donors don't give. In fact, I don't know that I've ever met a donor in my career who gives because of taxes. There's never been somebody who has no charitable inclination and then says, oh, but I can save 30%. Sure, I'm going to make a gift instead, right? The psychology of that, the reality is if you're going to make a charitable gift, you're still giving. And if it costs you less, it still costs you something.
Mm-hmm.
And so that we don't, tax savings and tax planning never convert somebody from not philanthropic to philanthropic. It just never happens.
You've never
We can
heard
be
like a
efficient.
You've never heard like a CPA just talk with maybe their one of their clients and just saying, look, you got a windfall of income and there needs to be something to where you're doing something with that income rather than being taxed on it at the level that you're at. Doesn't that introduce people maybe to the idea of philanthropy in a way that maybe they hadn't been exposed to before?
On occasion, and I certainly have worked with people who have had those windfall moments and said, hey, I'm going to, and I think a lot of donor advised funds get created in that moment,
Hmm.
right? And I think that's a perfect example of we have donor advised funds that are created because some advisors said we can reduce a tax burden and you get to decide where you want to be charitable later. So there is, we've disconnected with donor advised funds, we've disconnected charitable impact with tax planning. But just as often, the CPA is going to say, "Let's look at contributions to deferred accounts. Let's look at let's max out your 401ks. Let's look at other solutions as well." And
Hmm.
I hear maybe even more frequently, and it kind of drives the other point home when the CPA says, "Look, you can buy a new truck to get a deduction on your business taxes, but if you don't need a new truck, you're still out the money for the truck, right?"
Correct.
So you're going to have a an element of okay, maybe I'm going to be open to an idea of charitable giving, but I will say what I've seen much more frequently is not when we introduce tax savings, but when we introduce new asset groups and new thinking.
What do you
So
mean?
I've seen plenty where donors who are, let me back up a little bit. We have a tendency in as fundraisers to focus on cash gifts
Mhm.
and what's available for cash giving. It's easy, it's simple, it's easy from our perspective. We like it. And the reality is cash is usually, and there's a chart I reference all the time from Visual Capitalist that kind of shows the allocation of assets for different income brackets. So even in a total net worth of under 10,000, cash is less than 5% of the available resources. And as we move up into the billionaire class, it's less than 1%, or maybe right at 1% because as it breaks down. So when we talk about giving that comes from the cash, the psychology that ties to that, the resources that we're asking people to tap into is a very small pool relative to what their capacity could be,
Sure.
and B gets to their ability to do the vacation or invest in the next business or take on the next project. We're dealing with the most liquid of the assets,
Right.
and so we're narrowing ourselves. What I've seen is when we have conversations with donors that allow them and help them expand their thinking to say, oh, I can be giving from my appreciated securities. I can be giving from my, some real estate that I have. I can be giving from art or appreciated assets that I've got in other categories. That's what I see trigger for people who are philanthropic, really expand the amount of giving they're doing because we've opened up their eyes to a different pool. And it's not just in philanthropy. I see that in estate planning as well. When I sit down and people, most common question, what is, I don't have an estate, I don't need to plan. Oh, great. What they're thinking is, I only have X in the bank right now, right? I'm not life changing money in my bank account or even in to a certain extent, my investment account. But when we say, well, think about your house and think about your insurance and think about your retirement accounts, all of these things are out of mind for liquidity and for spending and for lifestyle. Now that number starts to get bigger. And then we say, now think about what that would do for your children or to your children, as we talk about affluenza, that same mindset, what can it be doing for charity? How much more do you have available now mentally. They can see themselves in a different space relative to their assets. And that's not tax driven. That's just kind of self-awareness.
How do you move somebody? I mean, obviously it's going to be in this context of developing a relationship, but I would say that there's going to be a lot of folks out there who would love to have that skill set to be able to bring somebody to recognize that liquidity is that disposable income idea that this is all we're working with here in order to to receive $100 gift or a $500 gift or $1,000 gift, which for many of these folks who would never see themselves as philanthropists, but just somebody who just gives maybe just because the need is there, or it's maybe there is something that, they'd like to routinely give to as well. But in terms of moving somebody along in a conversation to open up their eyes, so to speak, and to engage
Yeah.
these non-cash assets that are available to them. And I don't know. I mean, you mentioned something at the outset of our conversation just with regards to the storytelling. You mentioned Paul Harvey. By the way, I love his sign
Yeah.
up. Good day. Anyways, to
Yeah.
be able to have those types of stirring conversations to move a donor from being a cash donor to a non-cash asset donor. Can you kind of share what it is that you like to do when moving somebody along, or what's kind of going through your mind in terms of those steps that you would bring them to that place?
Yeah. I think there's kind of two things that are happening and concurrently. So, and they're both, I think, framed in the context of I never thought of myself as a gift officer, and titles and business cards are tricky. But the phrase that I settled on that to me resonates most, and I tried to share as I would teach, plan giving concepts or asset based concepts, is that we need to think of ourselves as philanthropic advisors.
I love that
And
term.
so I'll come to the specifics in a moment, but part of that is those of us who do frontline fundraising and have conversations with donors and supporters uh, often lack confidence and and don't appreciate where we sit for the donor. So you talked about the CPA, right? Isn't the CPA suggesting these strategies that are going to be philanthropically motivated? Uh, the reality is the numbers are staggeringly low of how many professional advisors that are not philanthropic advisors bring up charitable solutions.
They don't.
And if we think about it for a moment, there's not an incentive for them to do it.
Right.
One of the most influential moments from my undergrad was reading a book, or reading a study called "Rewarding A While Hoping for B," and it's all about what is the incentive, right? And so what we incentivize is what occurs, and that's not a negative. That's just human nature. And when we think about the advisors that our donors slash clients work with, what is the role that those advisors play? So part of understanding that role is also understanding how they're compensated. So I
Right.
love insurance advisors. I'm a big fan of insurance. Most of the time, huge amount of the time, like 99% of the time, insurance advisors are compensated as a commission on the sale of the product. That can lead to some insurance advisors who have a bad reputation, who are overly aggressive, who are always pushing for, and sometimes the relationships feels very, very genuine until the deal's done, and then where'd they go?
Then you're out of there.
And so that can be something that happens, and then you're out there.
Yeah.
And I would get approached regularly as insurance advisors. I love for their boldness, their willingness to have conversations and to try new things. They're the only advisors who reach out to charities on a regular basis and say, I want to talk to your donors and let me talk to them. And the reason is they want to make sales, right? They want to
Right.
say, let me introduce this solution. And the reality is, and not a knock on insurance, insurance is the most cost effective way to generate wealth, as long as you don't want to use that wealth, right? So the insurance industry is extremely tax advantaged. There's great policies so that they're able to kind of grow assets tax free. They're able to invest tax free. And they're mitigating in a lot of ways. That the math and the data behind insurance is spectacular. And the return generally beats almost anything else you can do because of this tax advantage world that insurance lives in. You just need to be okay that you're making contributions or you're giving up money and then not ever going to see that for yourself. That can be a great fit with charity, right? That's really, really powerful. It can get blown out of proportion. It can be done wrong. And T. Boone Pickens had a whole thing where insurance went way upside down. There's lots of due diligence, but inherently insurance can be a great tool for philanthropic advisors. But if you're working for the charity and your donor is working with an insurance advisor and you're operating at a pace that's consistent with your annual cycle, or you've also got some event, or the dean's got some project that you're working on, whatever it is, and you're distracted, that advisor is looking for to feed their family based on this deal closing or moving on. And so we want to be mindful of that, right? Why are they there? What's motivating for them? And acknowledging that means with them says, hey, we can work a little bit closer together. Similarly, we talk about CPAs and tax preparers. Absolutely necessary. Have great friends who do that. What you need to understand is most of the time, CPAs don't get consulted on the front end of the transaction. They don't get to give advice on how things went. Most of the time, clients talk to their CPA after the deal is done and it's
Hmm.
time to report it and record it. And how do we allocate it?
Right. And by
Right.
the
It's
way,
very rare.
figure it out for me.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, tell me what I did, and half the time the CPA is saying, "Well, here's what you should have done," and if you catch them at the right time, right? So CPAs are they're going to be busy coming into the initial tax filing season in April, and then just as busy coming into the real tax deadline in October. And what I
Mhm.
mean by that is increasingly that the higher the net worth is, the more sophisticated the asset mix is and the ownership structure, the more likely it is that the client donor is going to defer their
An
filings until
extension,
October.
sure. Yeah.
And sometimes, yeah, they're going to, I shouldn't, yeah, extension or extend it rather than defer. It puts off the filing, but they extend to October. There's lots of good reasons to do that. And sometimes it's because all of the other tax returns aren't done, even from the charitable side, right? Um, the for the donors who are in a pooled income fund or waiting on their gift annuity tax forms or their CRET analysis, depending on what the investments are, those returns can be slowing them down on occasion. So they're gonna be doing that in the fall. So if you're working with a donor and wanting them to talk to the CPA, or you're trying to connect with the CPA and you're trying to get an appointment on April 1st or October 1st, just not going to happen. And just as likely not going to happen on April 16th or October 16th, because now they're decompressing and on vacation, right? Almost every CPA I know has a block of time right after the tax deadline
Right. Right.
where they've got to go recover and
Yeah,
get
for
healthy
sure.
again. But because the CPA is usually consulted after the fact, um, and they can track the deductions and understand how they apply. They're just usually not in a place to say, hey, here's an idea, here's some giving. Most of the time, they're going to say, hey, you did this, now we can mitigate. There's some things they can do. Most of what they can do after the year closes, charitable is not one of them, but there are other things they can do for tax mitigation between in those first couple months.
I would
Attorneys,
imagine,
right?
yeah, just
Go ahead.
as I just think about, what you're describing is that, these professional advisors are so far, like you said at the outset, they're really not being incentivized. The insurance guy who needs a sale is not going to be incentivized
Yeah,
because maybe the charity doesn't necessarily see the connection and recognize how maybe there could be a connection there. From the CPA standpoint, they're being consulted way too late in the process, and by that time they got their paperwork all done, then they've just forgotten about it and they're moving towards the end of the year anyway because they had it deferred or extended until October. Now, let's
yeah,
talk a little bit about the incentivization though for say an estate planning attorney or a financial advisor. And what I want to just start thinking about is from the charity's vantage point, what are some inroads that can be made in order to begin to move philanthropic conversations forward? Because as you mentioned, for hopefully our charity and our fundraisers are switching from fundraiser mentality to philanthropic advisor mentality to be able to engage the professional advisor community, which is such an important component of their philanthropic success. So tell me a
yeah.
little bit about how these other individuals in the professional advisor realm that we typically work with are going to be incentivized that way.
So that's a great question. And part of, I want to skip to the answer. Part of it is to recognize that as the philanthropic advisor, you need to be confident enough and educated enough and willing to raise the conversations that prompt the client to talk to their other advisors. So if we'll talk about attorneys for a moment. We're seeing an increasing shift towards kind of flat fee work for estate planning, which I'm a big proponent of. But in the old days, if you're on the clock, if you're billing the client hourly or every quarter hour or every sixth of an hour for
Right.
a conversation, there's a hesitancy on your side to add a question because that's going to feel like is the client maybe think you're just extending this billing period. And there's an inherent, I've had many clients where I've always done flat fee work when I'm doing the conversation with the client. Sometimes I'm into day 2 or 3 of conversations before it starts to click and their mindset relaxes to say, hey, let's actually explore the big stuff. Let's think about what really matters. And that's unfortunately, I think, gotten even worse with so many solutions. And I'm torn as I say this because I want more people to do estate planning. Not enough people engage
Right, right, right.
in deliberate estate planning. But when your deliberate estate planning is a AI driven or algorithm driven conversation, right? It's a quick and the question comes up, is there a charity that you want to give to, or are there charitable inclinations? Well, 90% of the time, yes, somebody do have a charitable inclination. Quickly, no.
Yeah.
What we have to do, and so this is where we come back to the storytelling. And as philanthropic advisors, we can do this. And I need to give one more piece of context. Financial advisors is there's a whole aspect of how they're getting compensated, what they get compensated for. Is it a disincentive for them to give assets because that reduces their bottom line because assets stop being under their management to go
Hmm.
to charity, right? So
Correct,
we
correct.
want the or is the financial advisor fee based and are they investment advisors? Are they financial planners? Are they budget managers? Right? There's a whole lot to unpack in that space. The point is with all of it, with CPAs, with insurance, with attorneys, with bankers, with all of those other advisors, their relationship to the donor is compensation based. The donor is hiring them and paying them in some way, whether it's as a commission or assets under management or flat fees, they're paying them for that work. That's a different dynamic than when you're there, right? When you're there to have the conversation, when you're going to take them out to lunch, when you're going to have the conversation, and this is still donor focused. Now, I'll come back to the advisor side of it in a moment. You get to be there and have fun with them. You get to go back into the story. Most of my fundraising professionally was higher education. So you get to hear the story of what brought them to the school and what did the school do to them and who are they still in touch with and what have they done from that and how the school impacted their story and their progress. And you get to Joseph Campbell coined the term the hero story or the hero
Yeah.
journey and Dr. James has talked about it a lot, Dr. Russell James. We get to help them explore their hero story. And as philanthropic advisor, we're that guide along that story, which I love.
Yeah.
So that's powerful. And we have that. We need to embrace the fact that when we go to lunch, sometimes they're going to be on the clock, right? And sometimes they're going to be, hey, I've only got 20 minutes, I've only got 30 minutes. But other times, it's their chance to unwind and not stress about the bill or stress about what's coming. That we get to just say, hey, I want to hear, I want to talk, and I want to help you explore who you are and what matters to you. And then let's find out how we can be aligned with that. Now, I want to answer your question because I went off in a different
No,
direction,
I think it's
coming
such an
back a little
important
bit
point,
to,
though. I mean, it's really good. Yes, let's go back to the professional advisor side in just a second. But I just
yeah,
want to reiterate that point because, I mean, really, the dynamic that you're spending time with a donor in a way that's going to be radically different than a professional advisor is going to be spending with their client. To make matters a little bit more
yeah,
challenging is that you're going to have specifically, let's say, financial advisors or certain banks that are out there as well. It's like, look, you know what? They're just wanting to manage assets. That's their compensation. And in some of them, especially in financial advisor world, they're just dealing with maybe, 5 million and above. So in that particular case, let's say as a fundraiser or a philanthropic advisors, I'm trying to introduce into somebody individually to somebody who doesn't have that profile, that particular financial advisor who it's beneath him, so to speak, or her, and they're not going to necessarily deal with them because they're not a high net worth individual. So this person is kind of left off
Yeah,
to the side, and it's like, well, what do you do with them? Well, I'm sorry, it's just not my space. So anyway, so
yeah,
yes, that is part of the challenge that at least we see pretty routinely. So how do you then
yeah.
address that?
So if we understand, if we can put ourselves in the shoes of the advisor and think about what helps them, right? What's the incentive for them to be engaged with you? Why should they care? And what that comes back to is there's a couple aspects. The first thing you can do, and I've built kind of advisor networks and helped connect advisors to institutions, help them in their relationships with their clients, right? So if it is an insurance advisor who says, "Hey, we're having this conversation, and it's there's going to be a charitable component, or they want to set up this insurance policy for the charity," help them as best you can make that happen quickly and efficiently. Clear the roadblocks. Make sure, and this is part of what I do on the consulting side is let's make sure the infrastructure of the institution isn't going to stop a gift, slow down a gift, halt the progress. Because if you halt the progress that's affecting the insurance advisor, now maybe that gift happens, but I can guarantee you the next time it's not going to happen. And if the advisor has any sway, which I don't think they have a lot of sway on where the gifts go, but to the extent they do, if it's a choice between maybe a local community foundation that's figured out how to be quick and responsive, and your charity, which for all good reasons slows down or panics or puts 15 people in a room to say, well, maybe let's think about it, and forms a committee, where's that advisor going to work the next time? So having clear processes, being able to confidently help them know what the thresholds are going to be and how that's going to navigate, I think is huge for those advisors, because it's affecting their relationship. I think there's also opportunity. Every profession engages in stewardship and relationship building and client appreciation. And so if you can help them with that process, then that's an ad that you can make that's there. What you can almost never do, and in all of my years of advising, I would give referrals occasionally, but never on a quid pro quo and never consistently. Because if the client comes to me, they've already got advisors. Occasionally we'd get, hey, I need an estate planning attorney for, and we'd make some recommendations, and always based on what I knew about the donor and what I knew about the advisor. But those were pretty rare, right? I can count those on two hands how many times in 18 years I had those conversations. But what I could do and had a lot more of is, we're having an event. How about we give you a couple seats, and why don't you invite some people that you know that are in your sphere, that are in your client base, that have a connection to? And now they get to steward, you get to bring them closer into the program, you get to help them be more aware of it.
That's really a
That's
practical.
one.
I think that's a very practical component right there that you just mentioned.
Yeah,
Because I think one of the questions that was just kind of lingering in my mind is, okay, how do we now move these fundraisers into the space to where they're connecting with these particular professional advisors? In many cases, they don't even know who they are.
yeah,
And so that needs to be, a hurdle that we overcome. We do a number of professional advisor nonprofit networking experiences. And basically, we just say, look, you know what, as a nonprofit, you're going to need professional advisors in this space, this space, this space, this space, this space. They're all here. Make the connection. That's your job. So
yeah,
anyway, so we try to make that possible and we try to make that happen doing like a happy hour or whatever. But moreover is to engage a professional advisor in the realm of your philanthropic work and purpose. I would imagine it's going to be super, super important. So I really like the idea of just saying, look, you know what? We're just going to offer you and extend you a couple of tickets, and we would love for you to come and be a part of this and to hopefully begin to see what it is, not only that we're doing, but eventually begin to see how it is that there might be some overlap in the work that you're doing with us. And
yeah.
so,
And hopefully with finding those advisors who are getting to know their clients well, getting to know who of those clients have a connection or a hook or a reason that they're going to care, right, about whatever it is. And I'll Uh, we recently became dog owners, so we never had pets as a family. We now have a dog, and for my daughter especially, right? That's a huge part of her identity. And so if you know your client is always bringing their pets, or when they talk about their vacations or their trips, it's here's who's taking care of, or the dog's going with me. Um, then when you're advising, you're thinking, okay, where does this fit? What does that mean for both their estate planning, somewhat their financial planning, but especially their charitable giving, right? You want to, the more you know your client and their interests, and then also know what's out there from a charitable standpoint, the more you can connect and help them have a great experience. And I use dogs because, people, I've seen some really amazing opportunities and things happen around animals. One in particular,
Sure.
we were in Pueblo, Colorado decades ago. They would have this puppy ball, and I don't even remember what it was, but the dogs dress up. The people, it was a gala, but for the dogs, and the community. That community loved it, right? And if you're an advisor and you know that they're there, and it was partially sponsored by the Humane Society at the time, and so now the Humane Society gets to be a part of and mingle and have some of those organic conversations because that was a passion area
Yeah.
for people who those that becomes real passion. Fans, right? If you're fanatic, if you're a fan of the football program or a fan of the baseball program or whatever, and you can help your client, you can help the advisors connect their client with that experience, or they know that before you do. There's all kinds of opportunities there, I think. And you just have to think about your charity, what you do, and then how does that relate to the advisor. But remember, and this is the other part I think on the philanthropic advisor, that's that's a little bit of a scatter shot, right? It's important. Those advisors can be really important for the charity in helping clear the thresholds, think about the process, how to make things easier, give good advice there. And that's a lot of value that those advisors can be bringing, and they can become invested in the institution. But if the client who walks through the door doesn't have a connection to your charity, the fact that your advisor does isn't going to change anything, right? So you're
Right.
still in that space. So the kind of counter to that, or the related for the philanthropic advisor, is not just recognize that you get to hear the story, have a different relationship, but when you can suggest solutions, when you're the one who says, "Hey, have you considered?" or "Why don't you think about this?" and then the client goes to talk to the advisor, because to the other advisors, because you've made the suggestion, that puts you in a really powerful position with the donor. You're a trusted expert and helping guide them to a solution that's powerful for them, um, and elevates you with that advisor, and potentially is a chance to get to know an advisor. I met tons of advisors because they were part of the client planning process, right? We wouldn't have known each other except the client brought them to the
Right.
table, and then we got to know each other and work further down the road. But it is, just because the numbers are so low, and it's good work that I know you're doing professionally and personally, and as your organization, but also some of the other volunteer work that you do to elevate the number of advisors that are thinking philanthropically and having those conversations. But it's a tall mountain to climb. And so from a charity standpoint and from a frontline fundraiser standpoint, I think they're better served not trying to solve that directly, doing the things that we're talking about and being aware of it, but really being much more confident in their own role with those donors and in the conversations that they're having, because they can influence that one donor and the ripple effect through that donor is two or three advisors who are
Hmm.
now thinking philanthropically or see the experience, right? That's as powerful as any class or networking event or seminar that we can put on for those advisors.
Yeah. I like it. That's really good. And those connections and the relationships that you're describing are so critical to see that overlap begin to take place. And it's a very slow roll. It's not
It is.
necessarily something that happens right overnight, but it's definitely the task that needs to be on the forefront. Brian, here's the funny thing.
Yeah.
Our
We in the
hours,
plan giving world are in the long term. Oh yeah, our hour's coming up.
I
Yeah.
heard we've just spent an hour. It just happened. Hey, I wanna
Yeah.
ask, if you were to kind of give me the hit list for the OBBBB and what it means to philanthropy in terms of what you see coming down the corridor, if you will, and in terms of how giving is affected and how gift planning gets a little bit more integrated. What would you say is like, okay, these are the top 3 things you need to be looking at with regards to the new policy?
Yeah. So this is going to feel counterintuitive. My first thing would be ignore the OBBA, however many B's are in there. The
Sure.
reality is donors give, in fact, I was looking at some statistics, looking at the data on this for prior to TCGA 2017, it was about 30% of donors who would itemize. And after TCGA, it dropped to 10%.
To
So
10%.
10% of donors itemize,
Yeah.
which means the tax incentives went away for a big portion. I further looked at numbers, and of the 10, it's actually 9.5%. In 2022, 9.5% of donors, of filers itemized. Only 80% of that 9.5 were itemizing charitable contributions. So now we have 7.6% of tax filers itemizing. And so when I say ignore, for the most part, the OBBA, it's because it's not going to affect the donor behavior. So focus on the things that are going to affect the donor behavior. What is their story? What do they care about? What is your charity doing? How are you impacting society in all of the things that need to be impacted in society right now? That's going to resonate far more than, hey, by the way, if you continue to make the gift that you've been giving, now you can deduct part of it under this $1,000 above the line deduction rather than below the line.
Right.
When I did the math, when we first experienced this concept of having some deduction above the line, it was with the CARES Act, right? As part of the response to COVID and what do we do? And when you go through the mathematical analysis, we're talking about a net impact of literally $20 to $30. And I think it maybe gets up to $300 for some filers that is already giving you $1,000, right?
Right.
And now they have some tax savings amounting to maybe $300. That's not moving the needle. That's not where your time and your energy needs to be. So that's my number one from a charity's perspective. Lamenting, worrying, panicking about the numbers or trying to message around the numbers just isn't going to be a good use of the time. The other thing that I will say is happening is because of that, we're back to the word permanent. What I've seen from the attorney side is the advisors, the attorneys, the experts who historically have been tax focused are shifting. That conversation is moving to impact, towards legacy, towards what does it mean that this family is leaving, right? There's so few estates that are going to be affected by an over $50 million or over $30 million estate.
Right.
And the tools that we used to use back in the early 2000s are now codified that you don't have to do even the work that we did in trust back then. It's just
Right.
built into the system. So that part's gotten easier, and they're realizing, what does the conversation need to be? And the conversation needs to be about values and what's important to the donor and what's important to the client. And so that even the tax people are shifting to impact, legacy, meaning, not let's massage and think about the numbers. It still happens, it's still out there, but it's not the part that's driving, even for the guys who are experts in the tax field. So that would be my number two, is know that if you're having the story conversations, if you're having the personal conversations, that's where the tax guys are going to. So you're ahead of the curve on that front. Beyond that, I just haven't seen anything. Permanent doesn't mean permanent, and the numbers aren't significant enough that our philanthropic advisors should be worried about them or trying to educate or talk about them. It's a chance to say, let's talk about the impact you want to have and the assets that can be available for that. Let's focus on the assets. And OBA is not really about assets. It's about the reporting and the deductions, and those are there. So maybe that's my third, is remember that all of this, the most underutilized and most common opportunity is giving appreciated securities. So make sure your charity can easily accept appreciated securities, and the tax savings of giving the appreciated securities isn't affected by OBA, meaning the avoidance of the capital gain on that gift. That part's still 100% preserved. And similarly, if you're going to do the charitable rollovers or the
QCD thing,
RMDs or the QCD, thank you, is those benefits aren't really affected or changed, and those are far more powerful and educational opportunities because it opens people's eyes to assets that weren't available.
Yeah,
Those are my three.
And for sure, to that end, that's definitely, at least right now on the marketing front for what it is that we're doing, is we're doing a
Yeah,
QCD campaign with just about every organization that we're working with for the month of September and October, just like, mid-September,
yeah,
October, to that very extent, just because of the reality that if there's going to be incentive, it's going to be perhaps on that respect. But I would say that at the end of the day, it really comes down to that story and that impact and the movement of people to feeling like, you know what, I'm really making a difference here. And
yeah.
you guys are the organization for me to do it with.
This is my community. This is what matters to me, and we can do this together.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I like it. Brian, our time is done. I am really, really appreciative of just having you just join me today for this particular podcast. If it's all right, I'm going to say goodbye to everybody, but just stick around for just a second. I want to chat with you a little bit further and see where this all goes. But anyways, thank you everybody for joining
Absolutely.
in, and we'll talk soon.